Welcome to the Wolf Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. I'm your host Alex. I've sold and bought a few companies and also I've sold billions of litres. Join me on this journey to net zero. Download on Apple Podcasts. Season 1 brought to you by AIM Recruit, the leading recruiters in logistics, transport and energy at www.aimrecruit.com. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Wolf Power Club. It's probably been one of the most intriguing autumns in energy and policy. And today we've got a guest who brings those two worlds to light, is one of the main contact points for government. And it's probably the industry or the part of energy industry that I've spent most time in, and that's fuel distribution. I'm very welcome to invite Ken Cronin from UKIFDA to the Wolf Power Club podcast. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
Now, Ken has represented, we'll go into a bit what UKIFDA is and what it does, but it's fair to say that Ken is the main representative to government of our industry body. But for our listeners that might be from non-distribution sectors, put it this way, every litre that is delivered, and whether that is to petrol stations, to building sites, to houses off grids, to agriculture, to marine, basically comes through Ken's members. So today, Ken really does give a representation of fuel distribution in the UK. But before we talk about today's current challenges, Ken, how on earth did you end up in the energy industry?
It's a good question. I've actually been in the energy industry pretty much all my career, and I've got my father to blame really. When he came to this country, he started working for British Gas, so he was a gas man, reading meters, collecting coins, and so post university, I actually started at British Gas as a graduate trainee in finance. I then moved to the nuclear industry and I was in the investor relations department. When the company floated, I was chief of staff to the CEO, involved in acquisitions of nuclear power stations in Canada, the US, and I was also involved in the sad demise of the company as well, when power prices in the early 2000s went through the floor and the company had to be bailed out by the government. I then
Ken, before you go on to the next chapter, isn't it funny how our dads end up having huge influence? So my dad was a nuclear power engineer, and that's how I ended up, because I spent most of my summer holidays at places like Sizewell B, or as a kid going around CERN or stuff like that. So it's incredible the influence our parents have. So after the nuclear power station bailout, how did your energy journey continue?
So I then went into consultancy. So I ran a very large energy consultancy helping clients in stakeholder management, government relations, and it was really across the board. So nuclear, oil, gas, solar, wind, interconnectors, and I did that for over 10 years. And then I got lured back into the sort of private sector, if you like, and I ran and created a trade association for onshore oil and gas. And I think quite a lot of people were stunned to find out that, you know, there are 200 oil and gas sites onshore in the UK ever since the Second World War. So I did that for a number of years. COVID came, went home, decided that change of scenery would be good, and I got a call from UKIFDA. And UKIFDA, for those that don't know, is the trade association for the liquid fuel distribution industry in the UK and Ireland.
And I remember Ken sort of on the other side of it at the time, I think a lot of people know my work history, but as a director of one of the large distributors, I remember UKIFDA members started talking, going, "Oh, we've got a very political guy joining. He knows a lot about the thing." And at the time, I think we always felt quite underrepresented, not because predecessors hadn't done a good job, but I think certainly because there was a lot of names within distributions that I'd say are well known to their villages, but might not be well known on a national scale. We always thought there was a few challenges. What were your first few months in UKIFDA when you met our membership? And I think the first event I remember you at was there was an event in Birmingham at quite a nice restaurant, and I think the vicar who'd just done Strictly Come Dancing was on it, and you were kind of meeting and greeting us. What were your first thoughts? Richard Coles, that was it. Reverend Richard Coles was there. What were your first thoughts about the state UKIFDA was in and the membership and kind of those first few months at UKIFDA?
I think I would describe it as, if you look at who our customers are, okay, we've got 1.7 million oil heating customers, probably 300,000 businesses that all use liquid fuel. What binds them together is the fact that they're off the gas grid, they're rural, and they're in the middle of nowhere. And so I think my first sort of description was off the gas grid, seen and not heard. It wasn't part of the energy industry that I think government or even the media really understood. And so that was probably my first challenge.
I think it's a great perception. So for our listeners who might not know the UK so well, essentially there's always this rule of thumb that the closer you physically are to Westminster, kind of the more say and influence you have. But a lot of the very big multinationals and the trading areas are obviously within a mile of the Houses of Parliament. But when you get to some of our members, they might be on the most far away islands, off the west coast of Scotland or Shetland, and in real terms, they're 9 hours travel from Westminster. So I can see why you had that challenge, because as you said, they're in some very disconnected places. Now, just before we go on to the current situation, what's happening, you then obviously had the best part of 3 years. Obviously, government had some big issues to deal with, from Ukraine to COVID. What do you feel like the main challenges for UKIFDA during that 3 years? And I was just wondering if you could tell people a bit about the Ukraine crisis impact in the UK, because I certainly know it was a stressful time in the boardroom, and we're certainly putting calls into UKIFDA at that time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the first thing to say in terms of the impact on Ukraine, fuel prices quadrupled, literally overnight, and what made it feel worse was the fact that fuel prices had gone down so much during COVID, and I think one of the things that people again don't really understand about the industry. If you look at our oil heating customers, for example, it's pretty much the same fuel that goes into a boiler that goes into an aircraft. So during COVID, there was no flying, and so kerosene prices went through the floor. Literally, the morning of the invasion, we'd gone from 45 pence a litre up to 110 pence per litre. Everyone's on the phone. Everyone wants to buy. And it was a real shock, and also customers were very frightened. So one of UKIFDA's roles was to go out there into the media and say, look, this is what's happening, these are the reasons why it's happening, and just bear with us. And I think the second challenge for the members was, they were receiving, orders on a Monday, and the price had gone up by 30 pence on the Wednesday when they were delivering it.
I remember
really,
those times
really
vividly, Ken. I remember on the petrol side of things, I actually took a photo of what the live price was for myself to buy a few 100,000 litres to a few million litres versus what you could pick it up for at your local forecourt, which is obviously on lagged pricing, so it's kind of a week behind. And I remember the difference, as you said, was about 30p. And never in my whole career had I been in a situation where the so-called man in the street or white van driver could buy it for 30p less than I could as a trader and a wholesaler, essentially, of in the distribution world. And I also
Yeah.
remember that crazy period, as you said, with that COVID thing where, as you've just described, kerosene in both home heating and aeroplane, although there's obviously different compliance, the final bit is slightly different. As you say, the base product is virtually identical. And because you had all the fleet grounded, you suddenly had big aviation providers offering us kerosene at the most unbelievably ridiculous prices in that period because they just had nowhere to shift it to. I remember there's an airport where they just parked up every 737 that you can imagine just on the runways. And on the flip side, we were driving to the terminal to pick up kerosene, and you knew that those things were never normally parked on that part of the runway. So you it was, as you say, this crazy kind of swings back and forth and so on. But during also the last government, you also had challenges outside of events outside of our control that essentially members were being faced with in terms of the government looking to change their priorities on kerosene and off-grid fuels. And you guys had a bit of a victory, didn't you, with work from one of your Cornish members and George Eustace, who's been on the podcast before. Can you just tell our listeners a bit that sort of victory you had, because that was also a challenging policy time outside of the international stuff that was going on?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the reasons why I was brought in was to look at the whole decarbonisation agenda. And if you look at our customers, and you look at a typical customer, about 50% of their homes are built before 1919, so before the end of like the First World War. So those homes are very, very different. They also tend to be larger, they're remote, that they're at the end of some quite shaky electricity grids and things like that. And so we recognise that the decarbonisation options open to those homes were going to be limited and very, very expensive and very disruptive. So the idea was to actually say, okay, can we find a solution? Can we find a fuel that reduces the carbon in exactly the same way as electrification? But you can still keep your boiler, you can still keep your tanks, you can still keep your radiators. You don't have to insulate your home immediately, etc. And so you can reduce the cost and disruption. We ended up with a fuel called hydro-treated vegetable oil, which effectively is waste materials that's been refined in exactly the same way as crude oil. And we got a whole bunch of distributors together, 16 in all, and we put this HVO into 150 homes across the UK, so from the Highlands all the way down to Cornwall. Mitchell and Webber, one of our Cornish distributors, actually went knocking on doors in a village in Cornwall and converted a large number of homes, 2 local schools, the church. So we even got God on our side. And the demonstration project was absolutely brilliant. It worked perfectly. It was a complete like for like, 88% reduction in carbon emissions, and the consumer didn't have to change anything. And I think if you look at decarbonisation and you can say, here's that solution, you would grab it with both arms. The big problem we had was the cost of the fuel is a lot more expensive than kerosene. And okay, I think the average cost of putting a heat pump into one of those homes was about £24,000. The cost of converting to HVO upfront is zero. So there is a big upfront difference, but there was a cost of living difference. So The previous Labour government in 2005 had put in place what's called the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation, which is an obligation on fuel suppliers in the transport sector. And that had the immediate impact of reducing that financial impact in terms of the transport sector. So we asked the government to do the same for heating. We were really fortunate. We had a whole bunch of Lords. We had George Eustace, the local MP, cross-party support from the DUP, Plaid Cymru, and eventually through a number of different mechanisms, we got the Renewable Liquid Heating Fuel Obligation, the RLHFO, into the Energy Act in October last year, and that was, a game changer for us.
I think it really was, and I think what I enjoyed during that period is it felt great. Like we had a new product. I remember opening the first truck bunker in the UK with HVO, and as you said, it really was there. People taking a liquid product that you could either have kerosene variations or diesel variations, and really sort of reduce that impact. But obviously, your world has changed a lot. Obviously, at the start of July, for our non-UK listeners, we had one government that had been in for a long period of time, replaced by a new government. And I think what's interesting about the new government is quite often it's fair to say that energy isn't either at the top of the priorities, or the person given the brief hasn't been doing it for a long while. But I think what we can say about Ed Miliband, whatever people's politics are, he is in some shadow form been hugely involved as a shadow energy enthusiast for many years. And it's fair to say that from shadow to now Secretary of State, we have a new government. And I was just wondering, does that create new opportunity for UKIFDA, or does it create some same old problems? Over to you, Ken.
So that's the hospital pass question.
It's a tough interview, this is.
Look, when you get a change of government, there's challenges and opportunities. I think it's very clear that this government's initial requirement is to get clean power by 2030. And I think that's absolutely right, because you can't have decarbonised homes until you have the electricity to decarbonise them, and a method, i.e. the grid transmission, to get there to do that. So I think that's absolutely the right priorities. I think for us, we actually fit into that really well. The changes in the Energy Act last year had cross-party support, including Labour. And if I give you the stats, if we converted all 1.7 million homes that currently use kerosene into a 20% renewable blend, that meets the carbon budgets for the next 10 years.
So what you're saying is that with this blend, that already distribution can play its part in meeting 2030 and 2035 targets that are being met. That's unbelievable, because there's many energy sectors that are way off their targets or contribution. Can you just explain to our listeners a bit more about how it meets that?
Okay, so kerosene, pretty much every fuel has a grams per CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour figure. So kerosene is 298 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour, and HVO has a designated figure of 36. So it's 88% reduction in carbon emissions. And so if you do a blend, you actually get to the carbon budgets for up to 2032 by just replacing the kerosene with that blend. There are two separate advantages to it, which I think are really important. First of all, none of those 1.7 million homes need to be electrified, and so don't need any more electricity going to it. So from a clean power by 2030, you've actually effectively reduced the target for that. And again, not to be too geeky, but everyone knows me as the data man. If you were to convert or 1.7 million off the gas grid homes using oil heating to an electricity solution, you would need 6 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, which is the equivalent of half a new nuclear reactor that's been
Yeah.
built at Hinkley. So that puts it into context. I
And
think the other big advantage of carrying on using a liquid fuel is storage, because if you think about the current energy markets, we've got a lot of inherent storage in the system, whether it's gas in the pipelines and various other things. And so for people to still have tanks of fuel outside their homes actually increases energy security rather than reduces it. And so the requirement for storage actually goes down as well.
Wow, it sounds a great thing. But just moving on that debate and discussion, then is, and especially for your sort of membership, I guess someone that's kind of passionate about distribution and liquid fuels. I'm very much in the camp you've just talked about. I think it makes so much logical sense. But in the opening 100 days of the new government, and although this recording will go out a little bit later than that, but it's approximately 100 days around this week, is that we've seen that the big announcements have been 8 billion for GB Energy, which has just been announced as headquartered in Aberdeen, and Jürgen, that I know well from our days in the Northern Powerhouse working together, is going to be heading it up. And there's a further reported 22 billion that was announced only a few weeks ago for carbon capture. But where does that leave your members? Because it feels like not a lot of attention is being paid about how it can be supported physically for our members, and that essentially what's being proposed with the blend, the customer has to fork out for. But what potentially in the fiscal policy of the upcoming budget could help the membership of UKIFDA?
Okay, so here's the other big beauty. The impact on government in terms of treasury funding is almost zero.
Wow.
And there is two reasons for that. If they implement the renewable liquid heating fuel obligation, that's and the legislation's now there, so they need to do a consultation and they need to implement the legislation. The second bit, and again, it's very geeky. The kerosene fuel, whether it goes into an aircraft or into a boiler, doesn't get excise duty in the same way as petrol and diesel do. It gets VAT in the same way as electricity and gas. But if you put a litre of kerosene into your boiler, it's zero duty. If you put a litre of HVO into your boiler, it's 10 pence per litre. And it's to do with an archaic 1979 act. And all it needs is one little line that says, if you put HVO into your boiler, you will be treated in exactly the same way for duty purposes as kerosene. Because government doesn't get any money from kerosene, it therefore means there's no impact. So actually, we can introduce this with no impact to government and almost virtually no impact to the customer, because the way the renewable liquid heating fuel obligation works is the impact to the customers vastly reduced.
It takes me back, that Ken, as you say, is always, I always find with taxation, whether it's duty or VAT, to the old mind the gap sentiment of the London Underground, in that the gap comes about, as you say, due to history, and essentially, people like yourself need to represent that to get it resolved. It takes me back to my SEMA days when I was a young Shell grad studying my accountancy book, chuckling away at the famous Jaffa cake. Is it a cake or is it a biscuit debate? And it very much sounds like your Jaffa cake of 2024 is it kerosene for a boiler or is it not kerosene for a boiler? But it's really good for the environment. So your Jaffa cake's very much a liquid one at the moment, Ken.
Absolutely. But the reality is that the way the treasury, well, the way the duty works is that actually it shouldn't matter about the fuel. So if you put a litre of renewable fuel into a vehicle, it's treated in exactly the same way as diesel and kerosene. And that's all we're asking for boilers.
Fantastic. Moving on then a bit is a lot of questions on our podcast relate to net zero and people's roles and what they're investing in. We obviously had a really good chat on this podcast a few weeks ago with Boeing, and they're investing in everything from SAF, which I probably think your members will start getting involved in delivering in when UK airports start taking more of it. And I was just wondering that in addition to HVO, what do you see the role of UK distributors and UKIFDA in helping the nation to net zero? Because also I appreciate that some of the challenges are changing infrastructure, potentially huge costs up front with not necessarily a guaranteed customer base. So it must be a bit of a difficult position in terms of supporting it. But also, I do know there's big desire for these companies to be sustainable. So I was just wondering where you see UKIFDA and its members' role in net zero.
Again, it's a really good question. I mean, UKIFDA's role today has been to essentially is to be that conduit between the industry and government, but also, and more importantly, is to provide the data. And I think one of the things that we're all beginning to realise in the energy industry is that data is king. You can't do anything unless you have the data, and that was one of my big challenges when I came in. That we really didn't have any data. So literally finding out how many detached 4-bedroom pre-1919 homes is really important, because that actually underpins all of the policy and things like that. I think there are a number of things that the industry is also doing. So, for example, most of our fuel is transported by truck. And so quite a lot of the distributors now, their trucks are actually running on HVO. So again, a massive reduction in emissions and things like that. We're bringing new technology into the industry so that you can actually map the way the trucks go round, so it's more efficient and things like that. So there's a number of things that we're doing in the sort of wider net zero space. I also think hydrogen is going to be a possibility. I think one of the things that I find really important about this net zero argument, not one technology or solution is going to get us to net zero. And if we could all just agree on that and stop sort of flinging the ball across the net at each other, then we can open up that conversation. But I think hydrogen will play a part. Hydrogen will need to be transported, and we'll be involved in that too.
Brilliant. I mean, Ken, I got to say, your answer was music to my ears. Some of the listeners may or may not know, I've obviously gone from a distributor to a director of a data company that is passionate about the energy industry. And it's quite funny. I remember my good friend, Claudia at Fuel Oil News, actually asked me the other day, have you left the energy sector, Alex? I was like, no, the complete opposite, Claudia. The future is data. And it's those sort of calculations that your kind of data expert will come as key as your lawyer or your accountant or your trade body today. So it's great to hear that. And I think you're right on changing fleets. I remember when I was still in charge of one of the biggest fleets out of Thurrock, changing that over. The impact of that alone was north of 1 million litres a year of road diesel suddenly being onto HVO. And certainly I think your members need to be applauded, because for those who don't know, so many of the members have either changed whole fleets or huge parts of their fleets in a very quick succession to basically do as they preach, buy HVO from us, but also that they use HVO. Now, I think, as I expected, Ken, you'd stand up to all the tough government and members questions. Slightly few more fun, easier ones now. in your vast connections and little black book, or these days your phone contact list, who would you say would be an excellent next guest on the podcast that should get the Wolf Power Club energy, passion, and grilling on what to do next in the sector?
Well, I think one of the things that I've learnt about our industry, compared to quite a lot of the rest of the energy sector, is our industry's made up of small family-run businesses. So we're not big, large conglomerates in the main and things like that. But it's also, you end up having a big, a good regional footprint and things like that. You can reinvest your profits into that region. And so I think a really good example of that is Tim Ricks at Ricks Petroleum.
Okay.
He's done enormous amount in terms of the northeast area, and he's expanded into renewables, into solar and other things, and so I think he'd be a really good person to speak to next.
I think that's a great shout. I know Ricks Petroleum very, very well, and I've certainly had enjoyable nights with them at Harrogate and Liverpool into the late hours. So I might have to do an evening recording for that one. That would be fun. And then I was just wondering, Kent, you've obviously had a really varied career in energy. As you said, you've covered everything from Canadian investments, you've covered nuclear, you're now in liquid distribution. I was just wondering, two parts of the questions. What would you say to your younger self about the potential and the joys of an energy career? And could you also tell those people, because we get a lot of students listening to this podcast looking to enter the energy industry, or people who are currently in other industries, perhaps about UKIFDA's big event each spring. There's a great way to see insight, and if they are eager to get into the industry, how they do it. So what would you tell your younger self, and also tell people what UKIFDA does every spring that's very exciting?
Well, I think it's really interesting because we started this conversation talking about my dad. And if you think his first job over here in this country was collecting coins, 50p coins, out of a gas meter, and you look and think about how the technology has transformed in the course of one generation, and so looking back, if I was to talk to myself, I would say, think the unthinkable, because that for me is where we're going. Whatever we think it's going to be bigger, quicker, better than what it really is. And so I think that's and I think there are a number of things coming into the equation, like small nuclear reactors and things like that are going to be really important. In terms of young people, my best piece of advice to them would be, don't get put off by the way the industry speaks. The industry has always spoken in riddles. Three-letter acronyms. I guarantee you, if you look back on this podcast, there'll be at least some acronyms in it.
Definitely.
So don't be put off by it. We do have a annual event. It's on our website. Very happy to see people there. And one of the first things I did in our first event when I came to the industry was we created the Young Persons of the Year award, because it's really, really important. If you look at the energy industry in its totality, the average age must be over 50. And we need young people to come in to learn, but also to innovate.
Yeah, definitely. I am very biased because I've had 20 wonderful years in the industry, and I say I'm now doing AI in the industry. But as I say, I do think it's an amazing thing. I think if anyone gets the chance to go to UKIFDA, it's a brilliant way to, as you say, meet probably the majority of your members meet their sort of directors and operations people and commercial people in a very short space of time. And certainly I had a few people that are thinking about career change last year, in 24, and I said, look, bring your CV, just come along. I had some great chats. There is lots of nice hostings and social stuff, and you can just really find out about it and perhaps find what you'd be great in. So I'd recommend anyone to go to annual UKIFDA conference. And then we'll just end today again with our 3 quickfire questions that we ask all of our guests. So the first quick question, so we don't need a elongated one, is just where would you invest, Ken, in the energy sector with your own money in 2024?
Very easy for me. Small nuclear reactors, if I could afford to buy one, and energy storage, simply because I think that's going to be a really important part of the future.
The next quickfire question, we're obviously 20 days out from budget, so we don't know what Rachel Reeves has done. I'm not quite sure when the recordings come out, so please, listeners, bear the fact that Ken and I at this point do not know the budget. Obviously, we've heard rumours, but we don't know the budget. But what do you want from government energy policy in 2025? Because probably both policy and budget are going to change on the 30th of October. So I was just interested, what quick answer would you give to that you'd want from the Treasury and from Ed Miliband?
Very, very simple. Make sure you give people a choice. Don't impose something, because it won't work.
Okay, fantastic. And then the final quick fire question is, sometimes the bit that's really left out of the debate is the customer. I think you told at the start of the interview how many hundreds of thousands into the millions of customers that your members deliver to, how many businesses across the UK that deliver to. I mean, it's such extremes, whether, as you say, it's the most further away farm estate, or whether it's the furthest data or the most central London data centre storing billions of text messages and computing ChatGPT. They all use liquid fuel. So our final quickfire question is, what would you like customers to be doing with energy in the next year ahead?
Very, very simple. You need to get involved, and on our side of the industry, 3 years ago we launched a consumer information campaign called Future Ready Fuel. There's a website. Get on there, understand a little bit more about the options of decarbonisation, get involved with discussions with MPs and things like that. It's a hugely popular site, and I think that's a really good way to start.
Ken, can I just say, I've really, really enjoyed this afternoon. I think for all of our listeners, even if people have different points of view in the energy industry, Ken you always deliver both fact, reason, and a good value solution. So, I just hope that the Secretary of State really gives UKIFDA due diligence, because since you've come in, I think that you've really shown very straightforward working solutions for this country, and why your members are so important, and not just the jobs they provide, but essentially, as I say, pretty much anything that requires liquid fuel, your members are doing. Just to end the podcast then, Ken, can you just tell people how they can stay in touch with UKIFDA, and also that you don't have to be a distributor to get involved in the events?
No, so we have over 80 associate members that get involved in our everyday discussions. We have a national event every year where you can come and exhibit. Go onto our website and ukifda.org, and you'll get a lot of information and some contact points and things like that.
Excellent. As I say, just to end, everyone, I really thank Ken for your time today. I think also in terms of how great the conference is, our sponsor, AIM Recruit, has signed up for another year with UKIFDA because it was such a good event for themselves. Ken and the team were very, very kind to help do the soft launch of the podcast back in April in Liverpool, and the membership of UKIFDA, and I will be following up with Mr. Ricks to take up that challenge. We all wait budget in earnestness, but really thank you for your time today. Keep on listening, keep on subscribing. Thank you very much.